On the 31st of January, 1606, Guy Fawkes ascended those wooden steps, carrying with him a secret that would save him from being subjected to one of the most heinous methods of execution in the annals of history. The events that followed would go on to become legendary, but the actual horror of what was in store for him and what he narrowly escaped is still considered to be one of the most unspeakably terrifying episodes in the history of English justice. The man whose name we commemorate every November 5th was destined to die in a manner that was so violent that even the most seasoned executioners would subsequently regard it as inhumane. The majority of people are familiar with Guy Fawkes, since he was the person who wore the mask that became a symbol of defiance brought to fame by contemporary culture. The truth of what happened in his final hours, however, displays a level of cruelty that the majority of people have a hard time understanding. The execution that was planned for Fawkes was not merely about taking a life. Rather, it was about delivering a message through systematic, prolonged anguish that would reverberate through generations. In the Old Palace Yard in London, Fawkes was waiting for him on a scaffold that had been built with the intention of causing him the most amount of pain possible. Each and every beam, rope, and instrument had been meticulously chosen to guarantee that his demise would occur in stages, with each successive stage being more torturous than the one that came before it. A display that would serve as both entertainment and a warning was what the throng that had gathered on that chilly morning in January anticipated would be a spectacle consisting of hours of relentless torture. Instead, what they saw was a moment of desperate heroism that prevented the crown from acting as the symbol of total power that it was supposed to be. Fawkes's final deed would not only ensure that King James I would not have the satisfaction of a slow and excruciating death, but it would also solidify his place in history as a man who chose his own finish rather than submitting to the planned cruelty of Tudor justice. The full horror of Guy Fawkes's intended execution goes much beyond what the majority of historical texts dare to convey. Treason was punished in a manner that was not merely violent. Rather, it was devised by brains that had studied human anatomy and psychology with the intention of inflicting the greatest amount of misery on the victim while simultaneously keeping them conscious for the longest amount of time possible. We need to travel back in time to a period when public execution was considered both justice and entertainment, when the line between law and torture had been purposefully erased, and when the authority of the crown was maintained through displays of unimaginable cruelty. Only then will we be able to comprehend the full extent of the challenges that Fawkes faced. There is a great deal of religious tension in England in the year 1605, and Catholics were constantly under suspicion. Additionally, Protestant rule wanted complete allegiance from their subjects. It had only been 2 years since King James I had arrived at the throne, and he had inherited a nation in which religious identity determined not only social standing, but also survival itself. The conception of the Gunpowder Plot came about as a result of this oppressive environment. It was devised by men who were desperate and saw violence as their only way to achieve religious freedom. Fawkes, who had converted to Catholicism and was originally from Yorkshire, had already demonstrated his dedication to the cause by fighting for Catholic Spain and the Netherlands. Because of his military expertise, he was extremely valued. When the conspiracy was discovered, it not only sealed his destiny, but also sealed the fate of the conspirators. Fawkes was recruited by Robert Catesby, the brains behind the conspiracy, precisely because of his expertise in explosives and his readiness to sacrifice his life for the cause. There were 36 barrels of gunpowder, which was sufficient to collapse the House of Lords to rubble and kill King James I, his family, and almost the entire Protestant aristocracy in a single cataclysmic explosion. The scheme was audacious in its magnitude. The explosion would have been audible throughout London, and it would have marked the beginning of a Catholic revolt that the conspirators hoped would bring England back under the jurisdiction of the Pope. In spite of this, the discovery of the plot on November 5th, 1605 turned what could have been a successful revolution into a nightmare consisting of interrogation and torture. A large quantity of explosives, sufficient to level many city blocks, was found surrounding Fawkes in the cellar that was located beneath Parliament. The machinery of justice, which had been perfected over the course of centuries to crush both the body and the spirit, was set in motion when he was captured. The questioning of Guy Fawkes started right away, and it was carried out using techniques that the skilled torturers of the Tower of London had idealized over the course of several decades of dedicated practice. The rack, the daughter of the scavenger, and manacles were used in a methodical manner, with each session being aimed to obtain not only confessions, but also the identities of co-conspirators and the complete breadth of the Catholic network. One sentence that illustrates the deliberate nature of Tudor questioning is the line, "King James II personally authorized the use of the gentler tortures first." A purposeful escalation from less severe to more severe forms of torture was used with the intention of gradually breaking prisoners, while ensuring that they remained aware and lucid enough to produce information that could be valuable. Fawkes was subjected to this methodical annihilation of his body for a period of several days. His signature on confessions became increasingly unsteady as his hands became disfigured as a result of multiple sessions on the rack. The physical evidence of his torture, which has been kept in documents at the National Archives, portrays a story of deliberate brutality that continued right up to the date that he was executed. In English law, the punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was considered to be the most severe form of judicial mistreatment. This punishment was reserved solely for those who were found guilty of high treason. It was not just a simple execution. Rather, it was a meticulously organized ritual of devastation that could take several hours to complete. The purpose of this ritual was to display the crown's absolute authority over life, death, and human dignity. The victim was first carried through the streets on a hurdle, which was a wooden frame that ensured maximum humiliation while preventing the condemned from walking to their death with any sense of dignity. This was the beginning of the process. The hard cobblestones would rip at clothing and skin, and the jeering masses would shower the traitor with filth and stones, marking the beginning of the public degradation that would culminate at the scaffold. When they arrived at the location of the execution, the victim would be partially hanged, suspended by the neck for a period of time that would allow them to begin suffocating but would not cause them to lose consciousness or become unconscious. In order to ensure that the victim remained awake and aware of the horrors that were to come, the executioner's talent lay in estimating the perfect moment to cut the rope. The drawing phase consisted of the victim's garments being removed in a methodical manner, which was then followed by the opening of the abdomen while the heart was still beating. To remove the intestines from the body cavity, the executioner would reach inside the body cavity and remove them, frequently burning them in front of the victim's eyes. There are contemporary tales that depict victims who stayed aware throughout this operation, their shouts reverberating across the crowd while their own bodies were demolished in a methodical manner. The quartering that came after was just as deliberate in its cruelness as the last one. As human joints proved to be exceptionally resistant to being torn apart, the actual dismemberment of the victim was typically conducted with axes and knives. However, four horses would be tied to the victim's limbs in order to complete the dismemberment process. In order to ensure that the victim remained aware for the longest period of time, as was anatomically possible, the executioner would cut through bone and sinew while the victim's heart continued to beat for as long as possible. The final humiliation consisted of the public display of the severed head and body parts, which were often impaled on spikes and displayed at strategic sites throughout London. A hideous gallery of decomposing heads was created on London Bridge, serving as a perpetual reminder to all those who had passed by the dangers that would result from defying the crown. Throughout the years, this manner of execution had been perfected, with each component being designed to enhance both the physical agony and the psychological fear that the victim would experience. The people that flocked to watch these shows were not simply looking for something to entertain them. Rather, they were taking part in a ritual that was intended to validate the authority of the royal family. The annihilation of the human body was meant to serve as a metaphor for the unchecked power of the state. In the year 1605, the Tower of London was more than just a fortified structure. It was also a highly developed facility that involved the extraction of confessions, the breaking of human will, and the preparation of prisoners for public execution. The torture chambers that were held within its walls featured tools of misery that had been honed through centuries of use. Each of these instruments was meant to inflict particular sorts of pain while keeping captives conscious and coherent. The rack, which was possibly the most notorious of these devices, was a mechanism that at first glance appeared to be rather basic, yet had the ability to dislocate every joint in a human body. The victims were first secured to the wooden frame by their wrists and ankles, and then they were gradually separated from one another by use of a system consisting of pulleys and levers until they were completely separated. The process started off with a moderate level of discomfort, and it gradually escalated into a more severe level of pain as the ligaments stretched, the joints became separated, and eventually the bones began to crack under the strain. Guy Fawkes was subjected to a number of sessions on the rack, each of which was meticulously prepared to extract the maximum amount of information while also ensuring that he remained alive for his eventual public execution. The records of the tower, which have been preserved with incredible attention to detail, provide evidence of the trajectory of his physical degeneration. His original signature, which was bold and confident, progressively degenerated into scratches that were scarcely legible as his hands were systematically. As another one of the tower's preferred devices, they were successful in destroying the scavenger's daughter. As the torturers worked in reverse to the rack, they crammed the victim's body into an ever-increasingly small space. This continued until the victim's ribs shattered, and it became practically difficult for them to breathe. The use of this instrument was especially successful in shattering the will of captives who had first resisted the stretching torments that were being administered by the rack. Manacles were a more covert method of torture that involved dangling captives by their wrists for a period of time that could last for hours or even days. Shoulders and wrists were gradually dislocated as a result of the weight of the body, and circulation was cut off to the hands and arms. Prisoners who were subjected to extended manacling frequently suffered lasting nerve damage, with some of them losing the ability to use their hands. This was the case even if they survived their eventual death. The individuals who tortured people in the tower were highly trained experts who had a surgically precise understanding of human anatomy. They were well aware of the appropriate amount of pressure to apply, the length of time to keep the tension up, and the appropriate time to take brief breaks in order to avoid unconsciousness. Their objective was not merely to cause the victim anguish. Rather, they wanted to shatter the human spirit while preserving sufficient bodily integrity to guarantee that the victim could still supply information that was helpful. The detainees were returned to cells that were meant to prevent them from recovering in between periods of torture. The confined, unheated spaces, in conjunction with the limited availability of food and water, ensured that each day brought with it a new wave of weakness and hopelessness. There were times when the psychological impact of knowing that each daybreak could bring another session of deliberate devastation was more effective than the actual physical agony itself. Frost covered the cobblestones of London streets on the morning of January 31st, 1606. The weather was gloomy and bitterly cold, and the streets were covered in frost. Guy Fawkes awoke in his tower cell, aware that the day would conclude with his execution. Nonetheless, the method in which he would die continued to be a source of dread that had plagued him sleepless nights ever since he was sentenced to death. Carpenters had been constructing the scaffolding that would serve as the stage for his lengthy anguish, and the sounds of work had been audible for several days at that point. It was intended to be a final act of public humiliation, and the procession from the tower to Old Palace Yard was executed accordingly. Fawkes, along with his fellow conspirators Thomas Wintour, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, were dragged through the streets on hurdles. Their bodies had already been weakened by months of torture and incarceration, and they were being dragged through the streets. The crowds that lined the road were in a celebratory mood, and they was treating the event as if it were a blend of justice and entertainment. Old Palace Yard had been turned into a death amphitheater, and the scaffolding had been positioned in such a way as to provide the best possible viewing experience for the thousands of spectators who had gathered to watch the execution. To ensure that every individual in the audience could plainly observe the misery that would unfold over the course of the following hours, The structure itself was a masterpiece of premeditated cruelty. It was built taller than usual to ensure that everything was seen. The executioner, a man whose identity was securely covered behind a black hood, had meticulously arranged his equipment with the accuracy of an expert. A position was taken for the noose. The knives were sharpened to surgical sharpness and engineered to cut into human flesh with no resistance. They were positioned at precisely the appropriate height to ensure that partial strangulation would occur without rapid death in the victim. Careful attention had been paid to the fire that was used to burn the intestines in order to get the optimal temperature for producing the most smoke and flame possible. During the time that the first of the conspirators was being prepared for execution, the crowd sank into a profound hush of anticipation. The ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering had become so commonplace in London that the audience members were aware of everything that was going to take place. The partial hanging, the cutting down while the victim was still alive, the opening of the abdomen, the removal and burning of the intestines, and finally, the quartering of the body that was still alive. Guy Fawkes stood by and watched as his colleagues were put to death in accordance with their predetermined terms, with each execution following the same dreadful structure. Thomas Winter was the first person to pass away, and his screams could be heard throughout the yard as the executioner began to disassemble his body in a methodical manner. After Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes was the next person to pass away. Each of these deaths served as a glimpse of what was to come for Fawkes, who would be the final victim. During the time that Guy Fawkes was being carried to the scaffold, the attention of the crowd was now totally concentrated on him. By the time he reached the top of the wooden stairs, his legs, which had been weakened by months of torment, could not sustain his weight. During the last preparations, the executioner began to adjust the noose and place the victim in such a way that would have the greatest possible impact. Nevertheless, the events that followed would turn a regular execution into a moment of defiance that would go down in history. While Guy Fawkes was standing on the edge of the scaffolding, the entire horror of his impending fate stretched out before him like a roadmap of misery. In addition to hearing their screams and smelling the smoke from their burning bowels, he had seen his 3 companions being systematically destroyed. He had also observed the annihilation of their bodies. A moment of crystal-clear desperation that would define his place in history was brought about by the realization that he was going to undergo the same meticulous disintegration while he was aware. There was a well-established and well-known ritual that the executioner followed. To guarantee that Fawkes would not lose consciousness while being partially strangled, the noose would be carefully positioned around his neck and then placed around his neck. As the oxygen supply was cut off, his face would grow purple, and he would be permitted to hang for just enough time to begin choking. However, he would not be allowed to hang for long enough to be granted the mercy of death or oblivion. During that final moment of preparation, when the crowd was still and hushed in expectancy, and the executioner was reaching for the rope, Guy Fawkes made a decision that would reverberate through the years. His body plummeted down the cobblestones below with sufficient power to ensure that his neck would crack on impact. Instead of submitting to the prescribed ritual of agony, he summoned what remained of his strength and leaped off the scaffold where he was standing. The audience's first scream of surprise was rapidly replaced by murmurs of disappointment as they became aware that they had been deprived of the entertainment that they had anticipated receiving. In spite of his extensive training in the precise choreography of judicial torture, the executioner found himself confronted with a circumstance that had never been seen before. The deceased was already dead from the impact of his fall when he lay still on the ground with his neck twisted at an angle that was not consistent with normal anatomy. The desperate plunge that Fawkes had taken had accomplished what months of torture had been unable to do. It had taken control of his death away from the monarch and its officials. He had gained a type of victory that went beyond his physical destruction by making the decision to die by his own actions rather than by submitting to the ritual that was recommended for someone in his position. The individual who had been unsuccessful in his attempt to blow up Parliament had been successful in preventing King James II from experiencing the delight of a slow and excruciating death. On the other hand, the executioner was not to be completely cut off from his profession. In spite of the fact that it was obvious that Fawkes had passed away, the law had specified a punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering, and the law would be satisfied. After that, the executioner carried out the mandated dissection on Fawkes's motionless body, which resulted in a gruesome pantomime of the execution process. The throng gazed in awe as the executioner opened Fawkes' abdomen, took his intestines, and then burned them in accordance with the ceremony that had been prescribed. The limbs and the torso were separated from one another using axes and knives as the quartering process went according to plan. However, Fawkes's final act of disobedience had prevented the execution from taking place, which was the most important aspect of the execution, the conscious agony of the victim. The thousands of onlookers who had assembled in Old Palace Yard on that January morning constituted a cross-section of London society. These viewers included wealthy merchants who had paid premium prices for the best viewing spots, as well as common laborers who had arrived before dawn in order to ensure their place in the crowd. The manner in which they responded to Fawkes's surprise shed light on the intricate interplay that existed between justice, entertainment, and public spectacle in England during the early 19th century. During the initial moment of astonished quiet that the crowd experienced as they processed what they had observed, contemporary reports depict the situation. The hours of relentless torture that were supposed to take place had been condensed into a single solitary, critical moment. Many viewers felt that they had been cheated out of the entertainment that they had come to witness, while others showed grudging admiration for Fawkes's bravery in choosing his own death rather than submitting to prolonged anguish. The conflicting feelings of people who were present at the execution were documented in pamphlets that were distributed in the days that followed the execution. The final deed that Fawkes committed was deemed by some authors to be an example of cowardice. They went on to argue that a genuine contrite would have acknowledged that his punishment was the will of God. His plunge was seen by some as a final act of defiance against authority, and they saw it as a manifestation of the same bravery that had driven him to engage in the Gunpowder Plot. Niccolò Molin, the Venetian ambassador, issued a letter to the Doge in which he described the execution as a spectacle that could drive even the most heartless individuals to feel compassion. It is clear from his diplomatic communications that even among members of the international community, Fawkes's final moments were regarded as a manifestation of human dignity in the face of systemic cruelty. Fawkes's suicide was difficult to place within the framework of Christian theology, according to observers on religious matters. His death was viewed as a martyrdom by those who sympathized with him, but Protestant clergy condemned it as a catastrophic sin that would guarantee his damnation. Over the course of several decades, these theological discussions would continue, with each side asserting that Fawkes's dying deed was evidence that validated his own religious points of view. The immediate and measurable impact that the execution had on the economy was significant. At the same time that the proprietors of viewing platforms realized that dissatisfied customers were demanding partial refunds, street vendors who had planned for a day-long spectacle found themselves with an abundance of food and drink. Given that the execution industry was founded on the presumption that condemned inmates would endure extended agony, it was necessary for it to adjust to the new reality that condemned prisoners may select their own conclusion. Within a few days, the news of Fawkes's rebellious death traveled throughout England. It was relayed by travelers and merchants who had either observed the execution or heard personal tales of it. It was through the telling of a narrative that it developed, with each subsequent recounting adding additional information about his bravery, his last words, or the response of the crowd. When the news finally made its way to the countryside, Guy Fawkes had already begun the process of transforming himself from a failed terrorist into a traditional hero. Guy Fawkes's ultimate act of resistance elicited a response from King James I that could be described as one of hardly restrained rage. It was intended that the grandiose execution would act as a public spectacle that would serve as a warning to anyone who might consider following in the footsteps of the conspirators. The execution had been arranged as a demonstration of royal power. The Crown's carefully prepared exhibition of ultimate authority had been transformed into an embarrassing demonstration of the limits of royal control as a result of Fawkes' leap. Controlling the narrative that surrounded the execution was the primary emphasis of the government's early response that followed. The official reports were swiftly disseminated in order to diminish the significance of Fawkes' final deed. They described it as a moment of cowardice rather than courage. It was advised of the court historians that they should emphasize the effective capture and sentencing of the conspirators, while downplaying any evidence that the execution had not progressed according to plan. English jurisprudence was presented with issues that had never been seen before as a result of the legal implications of Fawkes' suicide. The execution of his punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering had been carried out on his body. Nevertheless, there were still issues over whether or not justice had been properly served. Academics in the field of law discussed whether or not the execution of a dead body satisfies the standards of the law, as well as whether or not additional rules should be developed for future cases in which condemned inmates might attempt escapes similar to those that were carried out. As a response, the Parliament passed new legislation with the intention of preventing future suicide attempts by individuals who have been convicted as traitors. A modification was made to the construction of scaffolds in order to avoid the possibility of convicts jumping to their deaths. Additionally, additional guards were stationed in order to physically restrain anyone who would attempt to follow Fawkes' example. The administration was taken off guard by his final deed, and these adjustments reflected an implicit acceptance of that fact. The response of the English government was subject to the scrutiny of the international diplomatic community. Foreign ambassadors reported to their respective courts that the execution had not gone according to plan and that the authority of the Crown had been questioned even in the time when it was intended to be triumphant. There was a growing notion that English justice, despite its brutality, was not flawless, and these reports contributed to that perception. The death of Fawkes was seized upon by the Catholic community across Europe as evidence of the brutal treatment of their English Protestant counterparts. In the meantime, Catholic propagandists depicted Fawkes as a martyr who had chosen death rather than submit to heretical persecution. Pamphlets were distributed that described the horrific nature of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Despite the fact that these publications were prohibited in England, they continued to circulate in the illicit market. The institution of Protestantism responded with their own propaganda effort, which emphasized the fairness of the punishment that was given to the conspirators and the charity that was shown by allowing them to be executed rather than tortured throughout an indefinite period of time. Instead of emphasizing on the perpetrator's admissions and statements of penitence, these official narratives made a conscious effort to avoid providing too detailed descriptions of the manner of execution that was scheduled to be used. The annual celebration of Guy Fawkes Night began almost immediately after the failed Gunpowder Plot. Nevertheless, the ceremony has undergone major changes over the course of several centuries as public sentiments regarding the man and his methods have shifted. A ceremony that began as a clear celebration of the Crown's victory over Catholic terrorism soon changed into something that was more complicated and confusing despite its initial simplicity. The early festivities of Guy Fawkes Night were exercises in Protestant triumphalism. These celebrations included spectacular bonfires that represented the fires of hell that were waiting for Catholic leaders who betrayed the Church. At the same time that multitudes were chanting prayers of thanksgiving for the liberation of King James II in Parliament, effigies of Guy Fawkes were burned with great fanfare. As much as these celebrations were intended to commemorate a historical event, they also served the purpose of reaffirming the dominant political and religious beliefs of the day. Over the course of time, the practice of building effigies of Guy Fawkes got increasingly sophisticated. Communities competed with one another to create the most realistic or symbolically potent portrayal of the failed conspirator. The children would spend weeks making their people out of old clothes that were stuffed with straw, newspaper, or other materials. After that, they would parade them through the streets before committing them to the flames. Over the course of the 18th century, The religious significance of Guy Fawkes Night began to diminish as a result of the increasing secularization and religious tolerance that occurred in English culture. The feast progressively moved from being a ritual that was explicitly anti-Catholic to becoming a more general patriotic commemoration. The celebration became to emphasize English resistance to foreign influence rather than Protestant opposition to Catholic plot. Guy Fawkes Night went from being a festival that was mostly held in rural areas to becoming a spectacle that was predominantly held in metropolitan areas. Factory workers and city inhabitants enthusiastically embraced the practice, viewing the annual bonfire as a unique opportunity for the community to celebrate together. With the addition of fireworks to the celebration, new potential for magnificent displays were created, and the explosive strength of these displays was comparable to that of the original Gunpowder Plot. In the 20th century, political activists began to borrow the symbolism of the failed conspirator for their own goals, which resulted in the addition of new layers of meaning to the celebration of Guy Fawkes Night. Guy Fawkes was portrayed as a guy who had the courage to oppose authority, and this image resonated with revolutionary movements throughout the political spectrum, from Irish Republicans to English anarchists. As a result of the publishing of V for Vendetta and the subsequent popularization of the Guy Fawkes mask as a symbol of opposition to authority, the change of Guy Fawkes from a villain to an anti-hero was completed in the latter part of the 20th century. According to this contemporary interpretation, the original meaning of Guy Fawkes Night was completely inverted. The man who had been burned in effigy in the past was transformed into a symbol of defiance against oppression. In the immediate historical setting of religious struggle in the early 17th century, the legacy of Guy Fawkes's final hours reaches far beyond the immediate historical context. His decision to choose death over prolonged torture established a precedent that would be remembered and invoked by following generations who faced similar options between submission and defiance. His decision will be remembered and invoked by subsequent generations. When it comes to conversations about human dignity in the face of institutional cruelty, the story of Fawkes's leap from the scaffolding became a landmark. His final act was cited as evidence of the intrinsic barbarism of judicial torture by Enlightenment philosophers like as Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria. They argued that no state had the right to inflict such systematic misery on any human, regardless of the crimes that they committed. As a form of execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering were all abolished in the year 1870. Which marked the end of an era of judicial cruelty that had existed for generations. As society began to question whether the state should have unrestricted authority over the human body, modern historians claim that public disgust at executions like the one that was intended for Guy Fawkes played a crucial role in the eventual humanization of criminal justice through the gradual process of humanizing the criminal justice system. Fawkes's ultimate decision continues to captivate contemporary scholars who are interested in researching extreme behavior under pressure because of its psychological impact. It has been evaluated as an example of logical decision-making under difficult conditions, revealing the human ability for agency even in the most severe situations. His decision to commit suicide rather than undergo protracted torture has been analyzed as an example of this. The death of Guy Fawkes is frequently brought up in contemporary concerns of torture and human rights as an illustration of the slippery slope that leads from lawful punishment to systemic cruelty. Historical examples, such as this one, are used by organizations that advocate for human rights to illustrate that any acceptance of torture, even in the most dire of circumstances, will inevitably lead to the normalization of abusive behavior. There have been greater shifts in how society views things, and one of these shifts is the current rehabilitation of Guy Fawkes as a symbol of rebellion to authority. The relationship between the conscience of a person and the power of the state is a complicated one. Things that people of past generations considered to be acts of terrorism are increasingly being interpreted by contemporary observers as a justified response to political tyranny and religious oppression. The Guy Fawkes Night celebrations that take place every year continue to develop, with each new generation discovering new meanings in the story that has been told for 400 years. Activists for the environment take use of the occasion to demonstrate against pollution, while political rebels of all shades use Fawkes's name to legitimize their own disobedience to authority. His life and death brought up a number of issues that continue to be relevant today, including religious freedom, political resistance, and the limitations of governmental power. This continuous relevance implies that these issues are just as significant today as they were in the year 1605. As a result of the story of Guy Fawkes's death, we are forced to confront unsettling concerns regarding the nature of justice, the boundaries of state power, and the persistence of human dignity in the face of systemic cruelty. His final leap from the scaffolding is more than simply a desperate attempt to escape the physical pain he was experiencing. It is also a demonstration of the human ability for agency, even in the most confined of situations. Seeing the agony that awaited Fawkes behind that scaffold, which consisted of the deliberate deconstruction of a living human body while consciousness was retained, exposes the depths to which civilized society may sink when revenge is disguised as justice. The fact that such executions were regarded not only legal but also necessary for the upkeep of social order is evidence of how quickly cruelty can become the norm when it serves the interests of those who are in positions of authority. Nevertheless, Fawkes's ultimate act of rebellion demonstrates that human dignity is not simply eradicated, even by the most methodical attempts to dehumanize people. His decision to die on his own terms rather than submit to the predetermined ritual of torture is a victory of the human spirit over the brutality of institutions. It serves as a reminder that even at the most difficult times of our lives, we still have the ability to choose how we will react to oppression. The transformation of Guy Fawkes from a terrorist to a folk hero is a reflection of our own growing understanding of the interplay between human conscience and the authority of the state. Each generation has discovered in his narrative a reflection of their own battles with authority, opposition, and the cost of standing up for firmly held values. The cruel and inhumane tactics of torture and execution that were used against Guy Fawkes and the other conspirators are part of a terrible chapter in human history that we would rather forget. The purpose of commemorating these atrocities is not to applaud them, but rather to gain an understanding of how rapidly communities may descend into barbarism when fear and hatred take precedence over compassion and justice. While we are lighting our bonfires on November 5th and watching the sparks rise into the darkness, it would be a good idea for us to remember not only the man whose name we invoke, but also the more profound questions that his story raises about power, justice, and human dignity in a world where torture and systematic cruelty have not vanished but have merely changed their forms. The narrative of Guy Fawkes, which dates back 400 years, continues to be uncomfortably relevant. The genuine horror of Fawkes's intended execution comes not only in the physical brutality that was planned, but also in the nonchalant acceptance of such cruelty as usual and essential. This is where the true meaning of the tragedy rests. The final act of defiance that he committed serves as a reminder to us that even in the most difficult times of our lives, we have the ability to choose dignity over surrender, courage over compliance, and hope over despair. This decision, which was made in a time of dire circumstances 4 centuries ago, continues to reverberate throughout history as a reminder of both the worst and the best aspects of human nature.